Good morning, good morning, good morning. We will be reading from our text today. We will be reading from Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. It's a beautiful morning. And we will take it from there. This is a well known story, the story of Gideon in the Bible. Um, so many golds of truth. I want to encourage you to read Judges chapter 6. We'll read about half of the chapter because all of the chapters are too long. But in your private study, I want to encourage you to read Judges chapter 6, Judges chapter 7, and Judges chapter 8 so you can get Gideon's full story. Gideon was a famous judge in Israel, or became a famous judge in Israel. There's only so many. I think there are a couple dozen judges when you go through the Bible for Israel in Israel's history. Um, but Gideon is one of the more well-known judges that we can remember, and his story spans 3 chapters, which is a nice chunk of time. It is not a long story like I'd say King David's story, or we have a lot of information on Paul in the New Testament or Jesus in the New Testament. Um, we have a lot of information on King Solomon in the Bible, so I wouldn't say it's a long text like that. But Gideon is one of the more well-known judges, and he did some great feats for the Lord. He had some wins, he had some losses, but I think we can learn from um, the route he took and the things he did. So let's jump into this text, Judges chapter 6, and we'll read about half. And it reads as follows: The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of Midian. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. They're hiding in caves and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops of all. Excuse me. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkey. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. They cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the land of the Egyptians, and I deliver you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me." Listening is essential. Verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Orpha that belonged to Joash, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have. Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me." Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. All right, we're going to stop at verse 17. As you know, the Bible scholars know, um, I'll sort of summarize the rest of the few chapters we have remaining. Gideon creates a sacrifice for the Lord, and then that being, um, obviously the sacrifice is a fire, right? There's an animal being roasted on a fire, and that was a form of sacrifice, one of the many forms of sacrifice back then. And the being who Gideon is talking to, the Bible says, goes up in the fire to heaven, right? So quite a interesting dynamic. Now, once that occurs, Gideon thinks he sees God, but the Lord tells him that he will not die, because we know if you see God's face, the book tells us that you die. So the Lord gives him cause for pause. Now, after that occurs, the Lord sends Gideon on a test. So the test is that he must go to his father's house, which was a sacred area for the whole town, and there was an altar there. There was a altar to Baal. Baal was a basically like a god, an idol that people will worship. So God tells Gideon to sort of tear that idol down, that belonged to his father's home and something that the people in his town worshipped. Okay, so that was the first test. Throughout the text, then we hear about the city trying to murder Gideon for destroying the idol because it was something that they cherished. It was something that they cherished, but he got through it. God protected him. Further, when we go through chapter 6, we find Gideon's fleece, which we'll get into later. The details, which was him in his doubts, he was testing the Lord. He put out a fleece, which is like kind of like a cloth material. Some people think it's sort of like a coat, but it's a cloth material. And he asked God to show him a sign that the Israelites, his small group or his small community, would overcome the Midianites and get themselves out of slavery. When you go to chapter 7, Gideon faces more doubt and discouragement. So God gives him another, I guess you can say, symbol, or gives him another hand of help or support. The Lord leads him to go to the other army during the night and sort of sneak in. And Gideon, as a spy, collects information that strengthens him, and gives him more confidence in going to battle with the enemy, which is the Midianites and the Amalekites. I will not get into chapter 8. Please read that on your own time, but it does give you quite a bit of insight on things that happen after Gideon and his army, the nation of Israel, win the battle and they're no longer slaves, and what happens when he has a bunch of money, power, fame, notoriety. And you can see the difficulties Gideon faces when all that's thrust upon him, that fame, notoriety, power, finance, etc. And it is a bit of warning for those who sort of maybe seek a high office, or who it just so happened that God blesses them with a high office, how pride um, or just being unaware can actually hurt you. So now let's go back to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. And let's start from the beginning with Gideon. Okay? Let's start from the beginning. Now, I want to say this. Gideon starts in a place of weakness, then moves to strength. When you take time in your private study to read chapter 6 to 8, it won't take you too long. And I encourage you to read it because it'll help you. It's a very memorable passage with a lot of wisdom. But when you look at the text, Gideon starts in a place of weakness, then moves to strength. Okay? So initially, the people of Israel cry out to God due to harsh treatment. And what does God do? He sends a prophet. That's what the text says. Now, what we initially find is that when we ask for assistance, now I'm trying to bring this to present day reality. When we look at this text, what I initially saw when I read from the beginning was that when we ask for assistance from the Lord or we cry out to the Lord, He hears us and He doesn't abandon His children. He responds to us, right? The Lord responded to Gideon every time he threw out a fleece or had doubts. The Lord responded to Israel when they cried out because they were slaves and they were being treated harshly, okay? And their lands, their harvests, their people were being pillaged and taken advantage of. God heard them, okay? Now they left the Lord initially, so they were in, I guess you can say, enslaved or in bondage for 7 years. But after the time that they served, after that expired, God came back to help. Now, we know that the harsh treatment came because Israel worshiped other gods and they didn't keep God number one, which is strange because when God sends his prophet, the prophet says, hey, God brought you out of Egypt. God saved you from slavery. God brought you into a land of milk and honey, right? Flowing with milk and honey. God brought you into abundance and peace and joy and happiness. And then you went to go serve other idols instead of worshiping him. Kind of strange there, but that's what they did. So this is a reminder for us to always keep God first. And the other reminder is that we can drift to worship other people or status or money, etc., etc. Now, if we break down the sexes, I'm not completely sure how women drift because I'm not a woman. But I am sure from life experience that certain things entice women. So the average woman, bags, the ladies like dresses, purses, heels, okay, watches, necklaces, gold, jewelry. That can take up quite a bit of real estate in women's lives. In the lives of women, I see that takes up quite a bit of real estate. Not for everyone, but for quite a bit of them. And for men, what do we worship? I've been a man all my life, so I know men. Maybe acquiring money on the job, is that one something that we worship? Let's look at some of the things we see in the news. For example, the Forbes list. We see that come out every year. The richest people in the world, or the richest people in the United States, or the 30 under 30, or the 40 under 40. I think they're starting to do 50 under 50 more often now. But what is that really about, those Forbes lists? It's about pride when we break it down. It's about pride. We all know it, okay? Now it's nice to see the glitz and glamour and celebrate people who have done well for themselves. But being on the list is about pride and prestige and power and celebrating me, okay? It's about me. What else do men seem to worship? High status. Being high status, not just in your own eyes, but especially others' eyes. In podcasts for the last 5 years, I've listened to several podcasts. But in many of the podcasts, we hear about this term called the alpha male. It's becoming so common now. The alpha male versus the beta male. And nobody wants to be a beta male. That's what these podcasts tell us, or these well-known podcasts tell us. But the alpha male is something that for the last 5 years or so has just been that cliche. Well, let's just say that it's become cliche. We hear it so much. Now, why is there such a desperate cry for people to be known as an alpha male or men to be known as alpha male? Why are men worrying about in our modern day their status so much? Not that status is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. I just think sometimes we go overboard with it when we start to worry about it so much, and we put all these titles on it like alpha male. But oh, why again, I ask the question, why are we worried about the alpha male status so much for men? It's because we're worshiping this title. We're worshiping ourselves instead of putting God first. And it often seems to me, not all the time, but it often seems for the most part, that the people who aren't looking to be respected. They aren't so desperate about being respected by everyone and thinking about what others think or worried about what others think. The people who aren't looking to be respected, who aren't desperate for it, are the people who seem to get the most attention and respect from the crowd. The people who aren't desperate for respect seem to receive it the most and in abundance, which is a bit oxymoronic. Now, let's get back to Gideon. When the Lord first approaches Gideon in chapter 6 of Judges, of the book of Judges, he calls Gideon a warrior. Those are his first words. He calls Gideon a warrior, actually a mighty warrior, if my memory serves me correctly. Let me go back to the text really quickly. What verse is that? It's verse 12. The Bible says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. He doesn't just call him a warrior. He calls him a mighty warrior. He put dubs on the pinto. Okay. So he gave Gideon a lot of respect when it didn't look like Gideon was in a very respectable position. So Gideon, when we meet Gideon in the text, he's in a wine press, which is obviously a place where you create wine. It's a part of the process of creating wine. But Gideon's in a wine press, but he doesn't have any wine with him. He's out there threshing wheat. Okay? So obviously he's just had a harvest. They cultivated wheat. And now he's in a wine press, going through the process of finishing up his harvest, so it can be of use. But he's in a wine press. Now, why is he taking wheat into a wine press? The reason he took wheat into a wine press is because he was hiding. If you remember when we read the text, when we originally read the text earlier, the text said that the Israelites were hiding in caves and in the mountains and in the cliffs because they were slaves and the Midianites were abusing them. So, fast track to Gideon in a wine press with wheat. He is hiding his harvest from the Midianites and the Amalekites because he doesn't want them to take it, right, and abuse him. He wants to keep his harvest and celebrate it and use it on him and his family, right? So, Gideon, when we meet him, he's in a place of weakness, but when God sees him, he calls him a mighty warrior. Look at that. Now, God calls Gideon what he will become. At the moment, Gideon is poor, he's afraid, and he's hiding in a wine press. He doesn't look very mighty at all. Now, when I read this, I thought, not only can the Lord call you a name before you feel ready and prepared, Gideon doesn't look like he's prepared for war, but God's calling him a mighty warrior. So not only can God or the Lord call you a name before you feel ready and prepared, but you can also speak life to your situation. Speech is so important. What we hear is so important. For example, the book of Proverbs, when we go to the book of Proverbs, we read Solomon's writing, the great King Solomon. The book of Proverbs says that life and death is in the power of the tongue. Okay? Life and death is in the power of the tongue. So not only what the Lord says about us, but what we say about ourselves matters immensely. It actually matters more. Those two things matters more than what other people say about us. So what the Lord says about us matters immensely. What we say about ourselves matters greatly. And what other people say about us doesn't matter so much. It doesn't have to matter so much. It really doesn't. Remember, the book of Proverbs says life and death is in the power of the tongue. What you say about yourself will destroy or assist you in terms of your self-esteem. So be very careful what you say, okay? Be very careful what you say. Now, after some time, the Lord tells, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, the Lord tells Gideon to move forward courageously and to defend Israel and to go and destroy the Midianites. Now, once Gideon develops an army or pulls an army together, he has about somewhere around 35,000 men. The Midianites and the Amalekites, their army is 135,000. So they have more than 100,000 men prepared for war. Okay? 135,000 versus 35,000. Who do we all think will win? It doesn't take much brain power to figure that one out. Okay? The elementary school students can figure that one out. Now, My next thought was, why does it take Gideon so long to move? Now he's seen an angel. God's spoken to him. God has been patient with him, but he doesn't move swiftly, right? He has this time with the fleece where he tests God. He asked God for a sign through the sacrifice. We read that part. Remember in Judges chapter 6, he goes and performs a sacrifice as a sign. He doubts more in the text when you read Judges chapter 7, and God leads him by night. He sneaks away by night to go listen to the other army and their plans. And from what he hears from them, when he's spying on them at nighttime, from what he hears from them, he gathers his courage and he's able to move forward. Okay. Now, in all the fear and the doubt that Gideon has, I will say this: he does have a few obstacles. Okay. Outside of the fear, he is the youngest. When we read the text, Gideon is the youngest in his family. And Gideon comes from the smallest tribe. And the Israelites are slaves. Let's go through that one more time. Gideon is the youngest. He comes from the family with the smallest tribe, so they're not very powerful. And the Israelites are slaves. They're being pummeled and abused. Okay. So he does have have how would I say this? A rational thought here, a very rational thought. And let's not forget that the Midianites have an army of 135,000 and the Israelites have an army of about 35,000. So they're outnumbered by over 100,000 people. So he does have a point. With that being said, this should enlighten us. When it looks like we can be defeated, if we have the Lord and the Lord is with us, like the Lord tells Gideon he's with him, then we should be fine. When the Lord tells us he's with us or lets us know that he's with us, we know that we have divine protection and we know we have divine power. Two P's: divine power and divine protection. Now, it was interesting. Before we move forward, let me go off on my tangent really quickly. What was interesting is that the first Gideon first tests the Lord in offering him a sacrifice. When he sees when the Lord comes to meet him under the tree, it says the angel of the Lord. When the Lord comes to meet him under a tree and speaks to him, to be sure, Gideon says, "Can I give you a sacrifice?" Interesting, right? To be sure, he says, "Can I give you a sacrifice?" Now, I like to think from time to time when I read this passage, how eager are we to be giving sacrifices to God? Do we just do that so easily? I don't know if we do that so easily in the modern day. And when we compare it to times of old, giving a sacrifice was a lot of work. Like now, we can our sacrifices aren't very time consuming. They don't require a lot of sweat equity most of the time. It's not. I don't know if the things we call sacrifices are always true sacrifices. So, for instance, when Gideon says, "Let me give you a sacrifice," he has to go to his home, right? Travel to his home, however far it was from where they were speaking. Might have been 50 yards away, 100 yards away, 200 yards away. We don't know, but he had to travel, right? So he had to expend effort. Then he had to take one of the animals he was grooming, right? One of the animals on his farm, whether it was a ram or ox or bull, whatever it was, goat. Those are things or animals they used to sacrifice in those days. But whatever it was, Gideon had to go get that animal and then destroy it, kill it, clean it, let the blood run out. You got to make sure it's kosher, make sure it's good. Then go through more work, vigorous work of chopping it up. Then once Gideon got it all ready to go, cleansed and all, he had to bring it back to where he was speaking with the Lord. So again, we don't know how far he had to travel with all those materials. Was it uh 50 yards, 100 yards, 200 yards or more? We don't know. We don't know. Um but that took quite a while. Um so that's that. And then he had to set up a fire, a sacrifice. You had to put the remains of the animal on a fire, and it created smoke, and that was a sacrifice to the Lord. Um, Now that's a lot of work, and not only that, it's sort of a dirty job. Could you imagine draining blood from a animal? That is not for the faint of heart. Okay, and I don't know if we now Gideon put a lot into the sacrifice. Now I don't know if we do that in our own lives in the modern day. How do we sacrifice to the Lord? Okay, do we put in a lot of work like this? More than likely, no. Later, one of the first commandments from God was to have Gideon destroy an idol in his father's house. Now, this was sort of a test. This is in chapter 6 still. The test was, would he choose his father, friends, family, etc. over God? Now, Gideon tore down this idol located at his father's home as God commanded, but he went at night because he feared for his safety. Okay. Now, what I haven't talked about in depth is that the whole city used to come bow down to this idol and worship this idol instead of the Lord. So it became kind of a scourge. Okay, it became kind of a scourge. Now, by Gideon going to destroy this idol, knock it over, burn it, take it down, this showed that Gideon put God first and not his friends or family or not his city. Okay. Now, let's bring that home to the present day. God tests us when we're committing ourselves to God or going to a new level with God or God's raising us up. He will test us with our environment, our family, the places we grew up in, um, the businesses that we grew, maybe mentors. He will test us to see if you're going to put your mentor before me. Are you going to put your family before me? Are you going to put the town you grew up before me? Are you going to put that group you like to be around before me? God wants to know who our ultimate allegiance is to. Or maybe I should rephrase that. God doesn't want to know who our allegiance is to because he's omniscient. He knows. I think it honestly shows us about our own self and our own character and our own modes and intentions. Now, God couldn't have a leader. I'm talking about a leader in Gideon, back to the text. God couldn't have a leader who was not aligned with him. So I'm going to ask you a question. How are you doing in this area? How aligned are you with God? Do your kids or grandkids hold priority over God? What about that family business or the business you're currently working at? Does that hold priority to you? Or does God hold priority in your life? Which one? Think about it. Which one? We should examine ourselves. That's what the Bible says. From time to time, we should examine ourselves. Now, at this point, when Gideon destroys the idol, he gets a new name, Jerubbaal. And obviously, that means one who contends with Baal. And Baal was the name of the idol, right? We still have Baal worshipers today. So this is real. This isn't like there are still Baal worshipers today. Just like in the text we hear of Israel, there's still Israel here today. This is a real story. Now, God changes the Gideon's name is changed from Gideon to Jerubbaal, or what people call him, after he completes his first assignment, right, and strikes down the idol. And after the name change, the Bible tells us, different translations say, the Spirit of God rushes over him. And when I looked at that, I thought his obedience and his allegiance to God brought about God's protection and strength, brought about God's protection and power. His obedience and allegiance to God brought about God's protection, strength, and power. Now, there's a famous story about Gideon's fleece because he was still worried even after all this had already taken place. All these things we've talked about so far. Gideon is still a bit worried about the battle. You have to realize 135,000 men are going against about 30,000 men. So in the middle of the night, he takes out a fleece and he says, "Hey, Lord, put water on the top side and not the bottom side if you want me to go." Gideon comes out and his prayers are answered. The next day, he says, "Hey, put some water on the bottom side and keep it dry on the opposite side." And the same thing happens again. God does the same miracle overnight. So Gideon gets this second, I guess you can say, this famous what we call the fleece, putting out a fleece that people hear talk about so much. We have this famous point in the text, and there's a lot to break down there. We won't get all into it all today, but the fleece does show a few things. It shows that after everything God has already showed Gideon, he still has doubts and fears. So it shows his humanity. He's a human, just like we all have doubts and fears, especially when we're in circumstances that we don't completely understand. But the Bible does show this. It also shows that God is patient with us and he understands our human frailty, that, hey, sometimes we might have fears. Hey, we sometimes human beings have doubts. But ultimately, Gideon follows through with God's plan. So God is patient with his people. He knows we're human. God knows we're human. Relax. God knows you're human. Chapter 7. Let's move on to chapter 7. God shows, God shows that the Israelites have a bit too many warriors. So Gideon has about 30,000 men when he's ready to fight and take on the Amalekites. But God tells him all of those men, or he says, this is too many people, about 30,000 warriors. And he says, you need to take this down. So he says, tell all the men who are afraid to go home. Gideon makes the announcement, and 22,000 men leave. Okay. So now Gideon has about 10,000 or so men left. Now, I want to say this really quickly before we move on. Let that be a warning to some of you leaders listening. More than half of Gideon's army was afraid to go to battle. He's got about 30,000 people. When he says everyone who's afraid can leave, 22,000 leave. So what that tells me is that people are more fearful than they let on. We can all put on a brave face from time to time. Even I've done that before. We've all done it before. When we're in doubt or unsure about a certain situation, we can put on a brave face. Doesn't mean we're actually being brave. So leaders, don't let people trick you. Now, back to the story. 10,000 warriors were left. Now, that was still too many for God. God put forth another test. There's just tests all throughout Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. We see God testing. We see Gideon testing. There's so many tests throughout this battle. Now, 10,000 of the men are supposed to go down to the brook to drink water, basically a river stream to drink. Now, the Lord tells Gideon, every one of the men who get down in the water and just put their face in it and are, so reckless and thirsty for water, send those home. And everyone who sort of gets on a knee and scoops the water with their hand and kind of laps it, scoops the water in their hand instead of putting their face in the river or in the stream, those are the people who you will battle with. So here was a test that the men were unaware of, a test that the warriors didn't know about. Isn't that interesting that God tests us when we are not aware? So out of that group, out of the 10,000 or so warriors that were left, only 300 made the cut. Okay. All the rest got on their knees to drink and stuck their face in the water. God was not for those people. He told those people to go home. He said, Gideon, tell those people to go home. So now you're left with an army of about 300. Now, why did he do that? I've read several commentators, and they have different things to say. But I did like one thing I read from a particular commentator. He said the warriors who didn't put their face in the river showed caution. Okay, they showed that they were being strategic. They showed that they weren't greedy. They showed that they would be alert during battle. If they could get down on one knee and scoop the water, that means that they were still able to observe the area around them. So they had some sense of awareness. Now, what is interesting to think about is that the 10,000 or so he told to go home that, basically stuck their face in the water, they were not afraid because remember, God told the men who were afraid to go home first. That was 22,000 men. Then the second round was for the 10,000 or so men um, who didn't express caution. Okay, they just went into the river and dove in head first. Okay, so what does that also tell us? That God tells the people who are fearful to go home, and God tells the people who lack caution to go home. So He wants us to be wise warriors. Okay, He wants us to be fearless, but also cautious simultaneously. He wants us to have some wisdom. Okay. And last but not least, let me add to that. One of the major purposes of having an army go from 30 or 35,000 men down to 300 and have those 300 men go against 135,000 was that God would get the ultimate glory and honor. Also, it kept Israel against being prideful, right? When you only have 300 men going against over 100,000, you know it's God. You can't be prideful, all right? Now, after this, after all these tests between the Lord, Gideon, and all these happenings, all these events, Israel took action. Okay, Israel took action and won a war. Now, were they the foundational power? No, and God was the foundational power. Okay, God was the um, main attraction here. Now we remember the story because of the odds. You have 300 going against 135,000, and the 300 win. Now, there have been many wars throughout the centuries, but we remember this one, okay? And it gives us proof in the modern day. How does this help us? It gives us proof of God's ability to act on our behalf when we're in trouble, okay? So I will end here. I'm sure we'll have a part two. I don't want to keep you too long, but as you'll find in the text, the Israelites end up winning this battle. Um, as the story continues throughout chapter 7 and chapter 8, especially chapter 7, Gideon and the army of 300 military men attack the Amalekites and the Midianites, force over 100,000 men to run, and they win the battle. And who gets the glory? We all know who gets the glory. That's the Lord.